The crisis that they were facing in Philadelphia was existential, and it needed to be dealt with seriously and quickly. And so he presented, as Kevin said, the Virginia Plan, or what would become the Virginia Plan, to set up the new nation's governmental institutions. And it was the product of deliberation amongst many, many participants.
Welcome to Being the Change, the official podcast of James Madison University, brought to you by Madison Magazine. Each episode brings you stories of how members of the JMU community combine intellect with action to live lives of purpose and meaning. That's being the change.
What's up, JMU? Andy Perrine here. Welcome to Being the Change. This episode is another in the series connected to the issue of Madison Magazine that celebrates the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And there's a bunch of articles in this issue that are actually written by faculty, and they're about some of the founding principles that have kept this experiment running for 250 years, which I think some of the founders would be astounded to know. And with us today are two faculty members, Dr. Marty Cohen from Political Science. Marty, welcome.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Appreciate you being on. And Dr. Kevin Hardwick from History.
I so appreciate being here.
Oh, I'm so glad to see you. Kevin and I know each other from way back, and we haven't seen each other in a while, so this is a little bit of old home week. But the article that Kevin and Marty collaborated on is basically how deliberation built a nation. One of the things I think is really important for us is that while we're going to be talking about the founding time, 1787, leading up to that, we're also talking about now, and we're going to try and tease that out in the episode. So to get us started, setting the stage, May 1787. Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure.
What did the delegates believe was at stake when they arrived in Philadelphia in 1787?
Well, they did not fully agree on that. And Madison knew that would be the case. There would be a range of opinions, and he arranged for the Virginia delegation and likely the Philadelphia, or certain members of the Philadelphia Pennsylvania delegation also to attend. And they sat down for a week and a half before the convention and hashed out what they understood the problem was,
Sure.
and then how they were going to address it. I've always thought that George Washington played a larger role than we usually give him credit for
Right.
In those early conversations.
In what way?
When Edmund Randolph stood up and gave this speech that launched the Virginia Plan, he made a very strong argument about nation building. He argued that the United States, with emphasis on the plural states, lacked the means to defend themselves in a world of predatory imperial nations. And if they were not able to replicate at least some of the kind of fiscal military capacity, the United States was going to be preyed upon. And so,
Which was happening in Europe all the time.
Absolutely,
Right.
to weaker nations.
Right.
And they had the example of Poland in particular directly in front of them. Poland had been partitioned by the great powers. I'm going to misremember what the date of that was, but it predated the Philadelphia Convention. And they were intensely aware of that example and other examples.
And the nation's only 11 years old at this point. And they were quite well aware that things weren't actually working to the advantage of the newly founded Union.
Yeah, there were a number of issues that really brought that home. One of them, weirdly, at least to me, is fishing rights in off the Newfoundland banks. Another was navigation of the Mississippi River. If you wanted the land on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains to be valuable and saleable and settlable, right? Farmers needed to be able to get their produce to market, and they couldn't do it without the Mississippi River.
And the Articles of Confederation were completely incapable of managing that issue.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Marty, Kevin mentioned Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. And you guys put him kind of in the center of your article.
That's right.
He's sort of the hero.
He is, yeah.
Tell us why.
Well, he was a talented leader who commanded great respect from his peers. And early on, he gave a monumental speech laying out the dilemma faced by those in attendance. And a sound continental government must, above all, secure the Union against foreign invasion and against disagreements between the states. And the crisis that they were facing in Philadelphia was existential, and it needed to be dealt with seriously and quickly. And so he presented, as Kevin said, the Virginia Plan, or what would become the Virginia Plan, to set up the new nation's governmental institutions. And it was the product of deliberation amongst many participants.
And I'm guessing that Governor Randolph probably conspired with Mason and Madison before arriving in Philadelphia over the Virginia Plan that was delivered.
He did not. He was one of the delegates who did not sign the finished
Ultimately,
document.
right, yeah.
And he had to explain himself. And so right after the convention ended, he wrote a long letter, which wasn't published until several months later, but in which he explained his rationale and he was very clear there about the necessity of having a strong union to defend the nation.
And he was apparently, he was only like 33 at the time, and he was quite well-spoken and very handsome. But Marty, what made his argument so powerful to the delegates who were there?
Well, he laid out the crisis and said the crisis was unavoidable and urgent. And it became crystal clear to the delegates in attendance that they needed to do something. The Articles of Confederation created a government that was extremely fragile. As Kevin said, it didn't keep the states from going after each other, and there was no national economy. There was no effort to regulate interstate commerce, and there was danger that the states would break treaties and bring the entire nation into wars they couldn't afford.
And so it was very practical rather than theoretical.
Yes, they needed to do something different, or else there were plenty of predatory, as you said, nations out there that were ready to pounce.
Right. Well, so once he sort of impelled the delegates to move forward in deliberation, explain to us how that began to unfold, because I think there's a lot of belief or misconception, depending on your point of view, that there was a lone genius or it was a brilliant mind singularly that carved the. I like to tell people it was Madison, given who we're named for, but that's not really the case. It was really a delegation.
Yeah, I think a better way of conceptualizing what happened was that this was a conversation amongst a group of extraordinarily talented political leaders and constitutional thinkers. Gouverneur Morris was nobody's fool. James Wilson, who later became a justice on the Supreme Court, and delivered a series of stunningly good lectures to the public immediately after the Constitution was ratified. Roger Sherman was another. John Dickinson from Delaware, another. There was a range. George Wythe from Virginia, who we tend not to talk about. George Mason, who wrote the Virginia Constitution or helped write the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It's just an extraordinarily capable, competent political leadership present, talking to each other.
Well, and thanks for putting it that way, Kevin, because it was hard work. It was not a sudden inspiration, a bolt out of the blue. Those guys worked. Marty?
Yeah, no aha moment.
Yeah, right.
No moment. Clearly, it was a process, the founding, and far from being divinely inspired, it was grinded out by fallible men who were doing the best they could under enormous pressure, I might add. Right? It's a cliche to say that failure wasn't an option, but it really wasn't, as I said, with the other nations, sort of right there, waiting to pounce.
Right. Well, and the way that Randolph positioned it as state building, which was kind of a new concept. Marty, what does that mean?
Well, it's really what it sounds like, right? Putting together the apparatus to run a government and to run a nation. and they declared their independence. They fought a war, but they had to secure their newfound independence, and they needed institutional machinery such as defense for the national defense, for a national economy. Methods of taxation, right? I mean, under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't directly tax citizens. They had to mostly rely on voluntary contributions from the states. So they needed a diplomatic apparatus to deal with the international players on the world stage, and this needed to be built from scratch. It was not something that just appeared magically out of the ether, right? They had to do it in 1787 in Philadelphia.
And this is after centuries of European nations building these institutions, so they were woefully outclassed in that way, right, Kevin?
Well, sure, but they also had the model for how to do it. And Alexander Hamilton, in particular, had studied the institutions that allowed Great Britain to be the preeminent military naval power in the world, and to reap the consequences, the benefits that came from that. So yeah, I mean, you can see it if you look at the first cabinet and the cabinet departments that Washington creates.
List those for us.
Sure. Well, defense,
right?
Right. It's war, actually, is
Sure.
the name of the department. The Treasury, because you had to have a professional army, which meant you had to have an army that was drilled, right? You had to pay them, and Department of State. That's it. Those were and the Attorney General's office. Those were the main officers of state in 1788, 89.
And one of the things that one of the quotations that came out of that period was, "Liberty without the ability to defend it is just an idea." So that was kind of their active animating thought, right, Marty?
Yes. The ideals were great, but you had to protect them, and you had to protect them from within and without. And so, yes, I think Kevin's point about the first cabinet gives us, the priorities that were put into place.
Interesting.
Yeah, and now present or past being prologue or whatever that phrase is, we're back to the Department of War.
Right. Interesting. Well, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Who said that?
I don't know.
Look
It's a
that
good
up.
quotation.
That's a great quote.
Yeah. Well, now, this wasn't all just happiness and everybody getting along and high-fiving and going to the tavern. There was a lot of disagreement, and there was not a full conclusion that what they came up with was the perfect ideal. As you said, Kevin, Governor Randolph wouldn't sign it, and Madison wasn't happy with it either because he didn't think it went far enough, right?
Absolutely. Madison comes around.
Sure.
And Randolph does too, eventually. But the document was an imperfect document, and everybody recognized that. It was what they thought was the best document possible under the circumstances.
Well, and so it really wasn't consensus then. It was really compromise under pressure because of, as you said, Marty, they felt an existential threat. And let's tease that apart in the concept of deliberation, and then we can get to then versus now, and compare what was going on back then to what's going on in today's governing.
I'm teaching a seminar to graduate students, and we read a book, which I've known about for a long time but never read, by a scholar named Mark Graeber. And it's about the problem, what Graeber calls the problem of constitutional evil. And Graeber points out that in order for a polity that is diverse to reach agreement on anything, to make something possible, an action possible, you have to be willing to remain in dialogue with people that you think are not simply wrong, but actively malicious. And if you don't do that, I think, let's see if Marty agrees with me, but I think politics is what you do so that you don't have to kill each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that means, and so the kind of quintessential topic there that Graeber is focused on, he's writing about the Dred Scott decision, but is slavery. It's an immensely thorny problem because you have a substantial minority of, slave owners, and mostly in the American South, with a lot of powerful people committed to it, how are you going to compromise with that?
Right.
Can you compromise with that? But if you don't, you open up the possibility of violence
and failure of the state. Right?
Yes. I mean, compromise is a key, and it was a key for them in Philadelphia. I mean, you had the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise over the legislature, and then what I would call the not so great compromise of the 3/5 compromise and between northern and southern states.
Right.
So, yes, I mean, it sounds a lot like what you described today. Is that people cannot, stay in dialogue.
Right.
And there's been a lot of groups that have come into politics. I studied the Christian right, and they had to learn how to compromise and to take half a loaf when they wanted all of it. And they became very good at dialoguing with others and working within the system. But now, that's the exception, not the rule.
Right.
And people in politics today, not to get ahead of ourselves,
Right.
but are not, able to, dialogue and communicate with others, even when they don't think they're malicious, even if they just disagree.
Yeah. Well, and in today's world, and we had this conversation with Kara Dillard and some of her students. Everything that they see is the objectification of the adversary, the dehumanization of people who think differently, and that's got to be absolutely corrosive to the ability to deliberate. And Kevin,
especially when you're getting your facts from divergent sources.
Right. And you were telling me, Kevin, before we started recording about a method of teaching in one of your courses where you actually have the students role play as the delegates in Philadelphia. What is your learning objective with pulling that off?
I want them to experience the world from somebody else's shoes, to see it from somebody else's perspective. And what makes it work is that over time, the students form an emotional attachment to their character. And it's strong enough that they've voluntarily, many of them, not all, but some, a lot of them, voluntarily do extra research simply for their own benefit.
Right.
Which, of course, is what education's supposed to be, right?
And they want to get an edge in the class. Right.
It's absolutely lovely to watch the engagement. In my typical classes, I have a fairly large number on any given day who call in sick, with quotation marks. And I give them the benefit of the doubt. Many of them, most of them are sick. But in that class, I have maybe 5%, 95% attendance. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
They want to be there.
Right.
And that's the entire ballgame.
Well, I love the fact that you told me that you, if you have a ROTC cadet in your class, you want them to be Washington.
Oh, yeah. I really like the idea that it's putting somebody who aspires to be a potential leader into a different kind of leadership position.
Right.
It's very nice. And
that's fun.
The better ones really appreciate it. You can see them growing.
That's amazing.
And they get support from the program, which is also really nice.
Well, in the article that you guys have in the Madison magazine, unlike back then where the threat was external, you make the point that our current threats are kind of internal, despite the fact that we're currently in a war and all of that. But describe for our listeners what you meant by the threats are internal.
Well, I think, honestly, the polarization, the intense partisan polarization that we see, the fact that people will side with foreign nations and foreign governments ahead of their opponents across the aisle in the United States is something that is brand new in my mind. Politics used to stop at the water's edge and, the rally around the flag effect. And, that was sometimes, not ideal as well. But at least, there was a feeling that we were Americans first and not Republicans first or Democrats first. And now, you look at the way the parties look at one another and their ratings are just, through the floor, right? 20% approval
both sides.
for both sides.
Right.
Yeah. And it's been, Republicans started to hate Democrats first, it seemed, but the Democrats quickly caught up in that metric.
Right.
So this polarization that has led to government shutdowns, it's led to political violence that is not unprecedented, but doesn't happen very often. It doesn't come around in this kind of wave. So the danger is, I think, that the compromise, the collaboration, right, to get things done. I mean, Congress is just not productive. They're not doing what they're supposed to, which is legislate. And a few Congresses ago was the least productive Congress in history, and then that was defeated by the next Congress, and then the next Congress was less productive. And so this is where we're going, and it's got to, I think it's got to bounce back somehow.
Do you guys have any ideas for a remedy to this, Marty?
Well, it might be interesting to have people be modern figures, political figures, and see how that would work. The media is, I'm not a media scholar, but the media fragmentation, has just made things worse. And, the toothpaste is out of the tube, sort of, but, maybe we can start to put that back in and start to, try to get us back to where there was some common source material. Like Kevin said, we don't have the same facts. How are we going to collaborate? How are we going to compromise? How are we going to even deliberate when we don't believe the same things?
Well, was it Madison that said a popular sovereignty without access to popular information is but a prologue to a farce?
I don't know that exact quote. I'm ashamed to say.
Yeah, it sounds right. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, it's, worse than a farce.
Yeah, right.
A farce would be funny, and it's not too funny these days.
Well, if there's a takeaway for listeners in this, how would you summarize this conversation? And you two as scholars in history and political science who are teaching our students, what's the way out of here?
Well, education.
Okay.
You have to put your faith there.
Yeah.
You have to put your faith in goodwill, and the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative really is violence, and none of us should want to go there.
So we're kind of at a similar time as when Edmund Randolph stood up in 1787 and said, this is an existential threat. So this is kind of a national emergency, Marty.
Yeah, I think perfect agreement should not be the goal. It never was it never was a prerequisite for political progress. I think we need to go back to getting a little bit of what we want, letting the other person have a little bit, and see if we can't find some common ground. It sounds pie in the sky these days.
Right.
But the destruction of norms, I think, is worrisome. Whatever you think about the filibuster, it does serve a purpose for the minority party. Court packing would be a disaster, and that's been coming up recently. So yeah, I think that these norms and on a day where Virginia's going to the polls, mid-decade gerrymandering.
Right.
That is a norm that is going to lead to an arms race, a gerrymandering arms race that will be horrible for our representation.
And institutions only work if people choose to uphold them, and that's going in the opposite direction right now. Yeah.
Madison wrote famously that ambition must, compete against ambition,
right,
and be balanced against ambition. And if you don't have ambition, if you don't enter the institution with ambition, you're not going to fight for it. It's if you've given up before you get there on that ideal.
When there's a lot of talk about the golden days of the past, but even back then, Henry Adams said in the early 18th century that politics is simply the organization of hatreds.
Yeah.
So it's always been thus, right?
Yeah. And it's hard to pinpoint, what has changed,
right?
When you hear something like that from back then.
Yeah.
And there was a lot that was wrong in those days when we had more comedy between the parties. The parties were very different. There was overlap ideologically in the two parties. Now they're so everyone's so sorted that sorted, right? Sorted,
right?
That it's really hard to reach across the aisle because it's a far reach. It used to be not as far.
Well, let's end this in a hopeful tone. We had some democracy fellows on a couple episodes ago with Dr. Kara Dillard at the Madison Center, and they run this program called Better Conversations Together. And the two students who were at the table were shockingly articulate and delivered a huge amount of hope to where we're headed. Kevin, let's start with you.
There are amazing people, public-minded citizens we have no shortage of them. The goodwill is there and can be mobilized. I have to believe that's true. I work every summer with some of the best high school teachers in the country and teach them constitutional history. And oh my goodness, it's an amazing thing to be teaching students who, every single one of whom is doing a better job of being a human being than I am. It's inspirational. I find that same level of inspiration from many of our students. We have this institution socializes people to come together and to join and to work together. I think that's an astounding thing that I find hope in. And boy, you have to focus on the hope, because the alternative really is dark and pretty dismal.
Although, one of my favorite poets, Fannie Howe, said that doubt is the secret engine to hope. So, Marty, what about you?
I would say that there's stuff going on at the local level that really could hopefully be scaled up. And, people, tend to work together to solve problems in local government because they have to.
And in nonprofits.
Yeah. For example, state governments have to balance their budget. And so governors are, good at working with the legislature and working that out. So I think people on an individual level, an interpersonal level, is not as bad as it is institutionally. And so maybe if we can sort of build up local government, local media, allow people to listen and hear these stories, that maybe we can scale it up and try to apply it to Congress and to the national stage.
Yeah, when you look at city councils or county board of supervisors, they're simply focused on how to use resources to keep the system moving, rather than who's right or wrong about who they love or what they're going to do.
Usually.
Usually.
It does seep down, and that's, it's difficult to insulate it from that, from that national politics these days. And I think that's partly the media, right? The lack of local newspapers, and people don't get as much local news, and they don't connect with their local communities as much. They're all looking at Fox News or MSNBC or, online platforms.
And that normalizes the dehumanization of the opposition.
Yeah.
Well, to both of you, Kevin Harderwyk and Marty Cohen, thank you so much for being on the program. As things unfold, love to have you back. This has been a great conversation. So Kevin, thank you.
It's been such a pleasure.
Marty, thank you.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. And remember, listeners, if you've got an idea for a future episode, you can be in touch with us at beingthechange@jmu.edu. Until next time, go Dukes.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to hear more stories about how members of the JMU community are being the change. Dive deeper and explore countless other stories at jmu.edu/Madison Magazine. Go Dukes!
The Being the Change podcast was conceived by Jim Heffernan, editor of Madison Magazine, and me, Andy Perrine, head of JMU Marketing. Thanks to Jenna Polk and her team at the Rose Library Studios, where the show is recorded by Cody Troyer, Steve Adderton, and Olive Santos, all of the crazy talented JMU photo video team, who then produced the final episodes at the Ice House in downtown Harrisonburg. Original music by 2019 alumnus Neil Perrine. You can find the Being the Change podcast on all the popular platforms, where we hope you'll like, share, and subscribe.